Hello and welcome to this edition of The Debate on France24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris. Tonight, new types of terrorists. It's been revealed that at least 6 suspects questioned in connection with last weekend's failed attacks in the UK were medical doctors. Contrary to what some British authorities first inferred, it hasn't been determined that any of the suspects have links to al-Qaeda. So who might they actually be? Do they symbolize a new strain of attackers that perhaps has to be fought with different means? And globally, is the war on terror being fought effectively? For example, are mechanisms in place to track and trace those convicted or suspected? All questions we'll debate with our panel here tonight. Joining me in the studio, Hall Gardner, professor and chair of the Department of International Affairs at the American University of Paris, journalist and author Maureen Cofflard, and via satellite from London, Gary Hindle, head of terrorism and international homeland security and resilience at the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let's first establish if our panel actually thinks these attempted attacks were different from those before. Based on what we know, could this indicate a different type of enemy? The fact, for example, that so many of them are doctors. Gary, let me start with you from London.
We're seeing a new type of motivation. We're certainly seeing also a tactic that hasn't been successfully deployed before, but the tactic itself should come as no surprise. We have the Durham Borough case of not too long ago. So I think it's unlikely that in terms of motivations, at least, we're seeing something new. What is new is perhaps that the nature of this group and this cell, and whether they formed here or abroad and were sent here. That's the key to this at the moment, I think.
Tell us, expand then on what, I'm sorry, we missed about the first 2 seconds of your answer. What is new about their motivations that you were implying?
I don't think I think it's unlikely that there's anything new about the motivations, and I think that's probably key. I don't think there's anything new necessarily about the tactic as well. We know that such plans have existed before. I think what might be new is the nature of their organisation, how they've come together, whether they've organised in the UK and radicalised, or whether they've been sent from their from abroad somewhere. And for me, that's the key to this at the moment.
Okay, expand on that then.
On
new about who they are, not their motivations.
About who they are, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they're doctors is interesting and new, but it doesn't necessarily tell us very much. What I think is really important is how did these individuals come together? Did they meet in the UK? Did they meet abroad? And were they sent here by al-Qaeda leadership or organisation elsewhere? If so, this implies something quite interesting and new. What that means for the indigenous terrorist capability in the UK, I don't know. If al-Qaeda is sending operatives over here in cell forms, that could all have interesting implications for how we view the current domestic threat.
And how might it change the approach to tracking these people and to combating terrorism in the UK where you are?
Yes, well, I think that fundamentally we're still heavily dependent on signals intelligence, that is, intercepting electronic communications for our intelligence. That's really the key to all of the information and the intelligence that the government gets. And in that sense, it really depends on the extent of the communications that this group has had. If they have been in contact with al-Qaeda leadership, then the chatter that we've experienced on the net and in communications should have been there. The gaps should have been there. We've had some reports from the US that there were some indications that an attack was coming in Scotland. So we're still heavily dependent on this signals intelligence. I don't think it necessarily would herald a major shift or justify any major shift within the UK and how we approach and think about it.
Okay. Hall, do you see marked differences in these attacks and the suspects that are being questioned now?
Well, I think the fact that this is a middle-class, highly educated elite that seems to be involved in this it really gets us beyond. I really want to put this in a different perspective. I don't want to see this as an Islam versus the West question. There seems to be an expression of these are educated people. They're not doing this unless they really believed in it. So there's an expression of moral outrage going on here. They're outraged against perceived injustice, discrimination, whether on the home front in Britain or abroad. And there's secondly a demand for recognition and respect for different groups and ideologies that they themselves seem to think that they represent. So their protest, of course, was timed politically. It was timed with the transfer of power from Blair to
Gordon Brown.
Gordon Brown, excuse me, Blair to Gordon Brown, and so it had a political state. But I think there's a social element here that has to be addressed, and that's where I see the difference. And that social element has to take into account the fact that there are moral injustices going out there that can be perceived whether or not you're Muslim or not. And if we look at it a little bit differently, we might be able to begin to come to grips with this.
Well, give me specific examples. What kind of moral injustices are you referring
Well, here,
to?
United States, the EU has pushed democracy around the world. As soon as Hamas comes to power in Palestine, we cut off relations with Hamas. That in their mind is pure hypocrisy. Use of torture, particularly torture that denigrates Islam and Islamic values. That also, I think, stimulates and angers these kind of individuals. It's these kind of people. I don't believe these kind of people would normally become terrorists unless they thought that there was a real cause and a real concern out there. That's where I see the differences.
But as we say that they are doctors, these are an educated, maybe elite group of terrorists, we also need to point out that they are still young men. Right. They're only, I think the oldest one so far has been 28 years old. It's a special age. You know, it takes time for perhaps to develop an emotional maturity that maybe these are lacking. So yes, they did go through medical school somewhere, some in Iraq, some in Jordan, it's believed, but they're still
they're angry young men. They're angry young men who think that the life should be better for them, and not only that, life better for those around them, and they're seeing Afghanistan and in the Iraq War, and they're seeing the situation in Palestine, and they're saying, look, nothing's been being done for that. The only way to do something is violent and to call attention to these issues. Because I'm not justifying the way they're calling attention to it, but the point is that that's in the background of what's going on. Now, to what extent they're linked to Al-Qaeda or something else, I really think that's secondary. Because what's happening is I think we're going to see more cells like this, whether or not they're linked to Al-Qaeda, people, individuals banding together that feel that they have a cause and they have to pronounce and make some sort of statement dealing with that cause.
Okay. Maureen, are we, in your opinion, looking at a different type of terrorists this time?
I think what we can find in common with past action is the fact there are doctors is not really new. I've seen people who were engineers when I was working with organizations like the Islamist or extremist organization. It was full of engineers, doctors, lawyers. So it's not a new idea that extremists has received education and are clever and intelligent people.
The September 11th hijackers, they were university educated as well.
Yeah, of
bilingual, if not trilingual, some of them.
And they have been living abroad, they travel a lot, so it's people who discover the world and who know about that. I think one key issue is probably that Al-Qaeda or these extreme group trade efficiency for multiplicity. It means that you can make 10 attempt bombing, even if 9 failed, like it is the case this time, like it was the case for the 14th of July 2 years ago, the second attempt after the 7. And it didn't work, and so the inefficiency of these terrorists is obvious. And probably we can imagine that 4 teams at 7 o'clock in a full metro in the morning should kill more than 56 people. So they are not very efficient, but the idea is to know what is the goal. Is the goal to kill a lot of people, or is the goal to create fear, to put pressure on Western country, and to show that you can act? And the second thing I find quite interesting is the need of discretion. And it goes through different channels. The first one is money. It was obvious for the 11th of September. You travel in first class, you have not so much problem to cross control and things. Here you've got Mercedes-Benz or big limo. There were another plot called the limo plot, who was said to bomb different places in London with limo full of explosive. And you put doctors. It's also a way to be much more discreet because you don't expect from doctors, engineers, or people traveling in first class to be terrorists. So that's quite the vision I've got of that event.
Part of the strategy. Gary, let me ask you, if you don't have any comments at this point, what about the tactics or what was rooted in Scotland specifically? Why Scotland. Was that a strategic area for them? Is there as much discontent among the Muslim population in Scotland as there is in Britain? I mean, and in England, I should say?
Well, I mean, I think that just on quickly on that point, there's no evidence whatsoever that the bombers were indigenous to Scotland or had any long-term ties to Scotland at all at the moment. So we can't draw that conclusion at all. And I think that there have been some reports that apparently that this is not the case. And obviously, there's great relief within the Muslim community within Scotland that is so. Just to go back to the motivations, I think that I would agree entirely that the motivations again about the injustices are there, but I don't think education is necessarily much of a factor there. I think education to a great extent can be a double-edged sword in terms of what you become capable of in your beliefs. I think the injustices are there. In terms of operationally and the tactics they're using and how we're going to counter it, tactically, I don't think that this shouldn't come as much of a surprise. The UK has been gradually increasing its hardening of targets across the UK in anticipation of this kind of attack over the course of a number of years now. So that shouldn't come as a surprise. I don't think that necessarily we should be thinking that this is all new and it's all changed. The fact that they were doctors implies nothing more, perhaps, and this is entirely speculative, that doctors are seen as an easy way of perhaps getting educated and capable people into the country in the form of a cell because of the demand in the UK and the exodus of some people from the Middle East.
Okay, but just going back to as far as Scotland is concerned in this case, you think the Glasgow airport was hit strictly because it was a UK airport, not because it was in Scotland?
Yes, I mean there may have been some political motivations and some ideas that okay, this is the home of the new Prime Minister, and perhaps it demonstrates that we can hit London, we can also hit Glasgow, Scotland, which shows a breadth of capability and would aim to inspire a new kind of fear further than within London. But other than that, I don't see much significance. We know that they were there for a few months or weeks, I think, at least, because they've taken out the rental on a house there. But
go ahead, Hall.
I just want to point out just 2 points. One, cost. I think it is true that a terrorist can go first class or whatever. I think that is a tactic, and that this creates less suspicion. And maybe it is true that the doctors, I mean, certainly doctors have been involved in other issues. But there's 2 points here. One is the cost. The cost is minimum relative to the overreaction. The amount of cost that the UK government, the United States, etc., is putting relative to the actual cost of these terrorist actions is nothing. They're not putting any money out comparatively. And this is purposely done to cause an overreaction, and that's the real danger. Yeah. When Al-Qaeda saw the reaction to the attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, hitting cruise missiles in the middle of the desert, $1 million each. That's in part what stimulated them to try again on September 11th, because they wanted the overreaction. Mm-hmm. So the real danger we fall into is precisely that, to letting these attacks, even if they're minor and fail, that we overreact to them, and that's what we have to hold off on. And the second part of this is creating a real dialogue with the Islamic world in general. That's very abstract, but it means dealing with these specific issues. Now, if we just another example, going back to the Mohammed cartoon issue, the Danish Prime Minister at that time refused to meet with ambassadors from 11 Muslim states. I mean, that wouldn't have stopped the incident, but at least it could have gotten a dialogue going to do something about it. The U.S. has only recently begun to talk with Iran. Now, Iran has got a separate issue than what's going on here in the U.K., but still, we have to open our sides and see. That's why I'm a technical approach. I'm reacting to a technical approach. I want us to think a little bit broader into a longer range vision on what we really have to do.
So you feel the reaction. We've overreacted in a technical manner, while there's been, broadly ignoring.
There's not enough forward movement on the diplomatic front, and there still isn't.
Okay, Gary, someone who knows the approach rather intimately, do you see that as true?
I think that, yes, I agree with that. The long-term solution, the social solution, the diplomatic solution is the only one at the end of the day. The difficulty is balancing the short-term prevention of attacks with this long-term aim and making sure that neither is to the detriment of the other. And I think it's been quite encouraging the last couple of days how the new Brown government has reacted.
Okay, Gary, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we're going to have to take a short 12-minute break now for news and weather, but we will return with this discussion after that point. Do stay with us.
I love this short problem.
Welcome back to this edition of the debate on France24. I'm Andrea Sankey in Paris, and tonight we've been discussing the war on terror in terms of how the enemy might be changing. Also, how is technology, our technology and techniques aimed at finding terrorists, keeping up? Well, joining me again to continue the debate in the studio, Hall Gardner, professor and chair of the Department of International Affairs at the American University of Paris, journalist and author Maureen Koffler, and via satellite from London, Gary Hindelt, head of terrorism and international homeland security and resilience at the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks all so much for joining us again. Gary, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk about technically what is being done to combat terrorism, and is it really enough?
Technically, I think in terms of, we can talk about legislation and technologies that have been introduced, perhaps.
Absolutely.
I think that, yeah, great. I think that in some respects, this is a bit of a wake-up call today, over the last couple of weeks, days, excuse me. What was used in the attacks in London and up in Glasgow, a lot of the new technologies that we're hearing about for explosives detection and so forth in tube stations and at train stations and other key points, these would have done nothing for us in this case. I think if you look to the Glasgow example in particular, what helped us there were bollards outside of the entrance to the airport, poor reconnaissance on the part of the attackers themselves. But those bollards, they were sensitive enough in a way to understand that they wouldn't be able to gain access substantially to the airport, and instead they tried to ram into the main waiting hall, which was in theory effective, but they were unable to carry it out. So technologically, I'm not sure that there's much that we could have done to harden the targets much more. And I think this highlights the earlier point that was made about the expenditure on homeland security, and really what we need to think is a bit more intelligently rather than simply spending money.
Interesting, because a different point of view came from Ronald K. Noble, who is the Secretary General of Interpol. He just wrote an editorial claiming that in the case of last weekend, it wasn't the strong measures you say that were already taken. It was instead luck. It was the careful work of the police department's bomb disposal unit, combined with the apparent incompetence of the terrorists themselves that actually averted real disaster. And he goes on to list all the things that are lacking to fight terrorism more effectively. He talks about the world still not having a global database of convicted terrorists. They do have databases available, but they're not set up properly to cross-check in the case of fingerprints. And effectively, he says, governments have failed to systematically follow up on thousands of people in possession, suspected terrorists as well, that are in possession of false documents that allow them to travel freely in the European Union. You don't see that as the case and a real failing on behalf of the security systems?
The second part of that point is valid, I think, that the tracking of people and the sharing of data, but those hold an array of bilateral problems in terms of the agreements, freedom of information, data protection issues, which are very difficult to understand. I think the points about bomb disposal and luck aren't necessarily my point about the targets already being hardened to some extent. They're not mutually exclusive. The point about data sharing I take on board, and there are measures coming into play that are going to help in that. But we do need to be sensitive to the civil liberties issues here about what data we record, who it's shared with. For example, the problems regarding the visa waiver program. The Americans are particularly sensitive about at the moment because they see the primary risk to their homeland security in terms of terrorism being those with easy access to Western Europe transiting to the US. So again, there's a balance to be struck there with the civil liberties and the implementation of the databases and the sharing of information that goes on.
Okay. Hall, what do you make of the technological and legislative efforts that are...
Well, I'd like to emphasize the fact that we just don't have the people on the ground. We need people to infiltrate these groups. If it's true that these groups have... they may not be using the Internet anymore because they may know that their Internets are being tampered with or somehow spied upon, so they're going to go word of mouth, spread information one way, the old-fashioned way. And I've been shocked at the lack of language. Well, that's another issue, of course. Getting people to know Arabic or Pushtun or other languages that would be helpful is very difficult, and have them infiltrate groups takes years. obviously, but that's one aspect of this has to take place. The other aspect is simply having the translator, the interpreters who know who are sophisticated enough with the different languages. I mean, the United States is in Baghdad with 6 interpreters they're managing a whole war with 6 fully fluent Arabic interpreters, according to the Baker-Hamilton report. Now, they've upgraded that since that report. They've upgraded some of the experts there, language experts at that time. But my point is we're dealing with a culture that we have distance from, that we don't understand, that we have some domestic experience with, but we've really just got to start thinking, and we're thinking in cultural terms and not just political and technical terms.
Okay, Maureen?
I would put a nuance on that because, like for the 7th July's bombing, the people were speaking English. They were not speaking Arabic, none of them. They were living in England, and so of course, infiltration is the main work, and I think the result, the bombing we had that time, is a very basic one, and it's really the result of in some way, the efficiency of intelligence services, which is you've got this pressure from intelligence. If they are watching networks with credit cards, with money, with explosive. So to stay in the shade, you need to use what has been used: gas cylinder, nails, petrol. And once again, you can't have zero risk. It's the biggest problem. Then you have to work on the causes, as you say, on the social causes, on the reason why London, why England, once again, is targeted like that. So it's a combination of all that. But I think we can't say the measure has been failing, because you can't put bobbies behind every Muslim. It's impossible, and it's also a danger, because what these people want is to create fear, to create fear in our mind, and to say, okay, freedom, okay, like if you take a plane now, you have to give your tooth mask, you have to give. I mean, it starts to be crazy and stupid, and never forget that humanity and human people will always find a way to slice the rules.
Yeah. Gary, did you have a comment? Was I hearing you interject?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we're going back to the point about the broader, wider interests that are at play, and the issues that we might need to address in terms of foreign policy that Hall's alluded to on a couple of occasions. That's very important, but I think if you look at some of the demands that are being made by Islamist elements, both within the UK and further abroad now, some of these demands are things that we could never submit to. So the negotiation is there. Diplomacy is always an option. I think we can undermine the recruitment to sort of extremist notions of Islam, but in terms of how we're dealing with the current threat, the current problem, in terms of changing people's minds who've already been indoctrinated, who've already been radicalized, I don't think we can really be looking to counter that. I know that I've heard that in Saudi Arabia they apparently have a program which has a 100% success rate in de-radicalizing individuals. I don't know what sort of measures they use to do that, but I don't think it's something that we can look to do in the UK, given what has been said to be the scale of the problem here. So I think we are back again at this balance between putting the new measures in place and thinking long term about what we're doing abroad that affects this.
Well, let's look at perhaps then preventative measures. If you say we can't go back and de-radicalize those that are already they have their minds made up, is enough, do you think, being done then to protect Britain's Muslim population in the wake of attacks like these? There have already been lists of complaints now from Muslim citizens of Britain. A number of Muslim taxi drivers come out and said that they've been attacked by young white males, and Muslim women walking on the streets of Glasgow and London have said that they've had their headscarves ripped off their heads while walking on the streets. Does Britain perhaps need to keep a closer eye on the backlash as part of a prevention technique? Could that be effective, Hall?
Well, I
think
would,
Go ahead, Gary.
Gary.
Sorry, okay, thanks. As I said earlier, I think that's always a problem. I think that it's important to note, though, that this is always posited as a real risk, and it does happen, but it tends to be flash-in-the-pan incidents, and it happens for a period after a major scare or a major incident, but it's never a long-term problem within the UK. It never manifests itself in any extreme forms. If you only have to look back to the situation in the UK that existed in the 70s and the 80s when we had the problem with Irish Republican terrorism. The sorts of attitudes that you had then in the UK towards the Irish were incredible to us now, and we're nowhere near that. And when it comes to the reaction to the Muslim populations, when we've had some potentially devastating attacks that have been prevented. So I think that's definitely an important consideration, and I think that the Brown government over the last couple of days has demonstrated quite adequately their sensitivity to that, and the police forces as well have been quick to reiterate that they will not tolerate any of this sort of behaviour.
Go ahead.
If I may add to that, from my experience here in France, is that if you remember the riots and the car burnings just before the elections and how the rhetoric of that time literally fueled the situation, I think we've seen a different approach with Sarkozy coming as president and appointing Rachida Dati as his justice minister. I think this was a brilliant approach in bringing someone from North African origin into power, empowering, and at least providing hope that there is a way to be integrated and part of French society, even if it may be a token effort at this time. It at least opens the door for the future. And I think the more you can show that people from North Africa or the Islamic world are respected in England, France, the United States, Europe in general, at least you'll begin to take some of the moderates that might be willing or moving towards radicalism, at least prevent them from going too far. But I agree with you totally that we're not going to get rid of the hardliners, and so we have to concentrate on those and attempt to crack down where we can. I'm just not so sure all the fancy national technical means are going to work in that regard as well.
Okay, Maureen.
Could I?
Go ahead, Gary. Let you respond quickly.
I just want to say I think that I agree with you there. The difficulty that the UK government has been, first of all, being the government that's invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq and the intervention in Bosnia, which has been enormously problematic for its relationships with the Muslim community for the clear reasons. The difficulty has been that when the government has tried to engage, it's found it enormously difficult to identify the representative groups, those that aren't simply out to are not concerned with their own narrow political interest, and those that aren't in fact extremists dressed as moderates. So it's very difficult for the government to do that for those two very clear reasons. I think that now we're approaching a period where, quite surprisingly really, I think that the current government can separate itself from the past, from the Tony Blair associations with Iraq, and if it can play the politics carefully and play it well, we can look at building this gap, this separation between the Blair government and the Brown government, and in that way put a divide in between the current hardliners and those that are the sort of potential sympathetic communities, if you will.
Go ahead, Maureen.
I think just one thing we can say to people is that in nearly 100% of the case, the extremists or the terrorists separate also from the moderate Muslim community. So we have to really deepen the collaboration with Muslim community. It's like what we can't really do in Israel, which is to speak the moderate people from every camp. And we can do that in Western countries and in France, in Britain, and it's already done, but we can intensify this relationship and explain to people how it's useful, how the moderate Muslim community helps to stop, to prevent from other bombings. And if you explain that more and more, probably these events, and of course if you work on discrimination and stupid behaviors, it can help. It's like hooligans. I mean, when you like football, you're not hooligans, and probably the people who like most the food can fight the best against hooligans. It's the same with the Muslim. The moderate Muslim are maybe the best to fight against extremist Muslims.
Sure, but a real concern then in Britain is a number of studies that have come out that have said those moderate Muslims you're talking about, that you say are so separate from the extremists, actually aren't that separate anymore. Many of them are actually radicalizing or becoming more radical themselves, especially among younger groups. They believe Sharia law would be better applied in Britain to their communities than British. Gary, I hear you trying to chime in here, that they would be better off applied to the Muslim community in Britain, and that there is this radicalization of the Muslim communities that have been there for years, the same ones that Maureen was talking about that can't even speak Arabic.
you have to understand that this is a problem that goes back decades in the United Kingdom. We're not talking about a phenomenon that is 10 years old or less. We're talking about back to the 1980s when and from the early 1980s probably up until the mid 90s we had within the Muslim communities pitched battles going on in the streets sometimes for control of mosques between the extremists, the Islamists and those who consider Islam as a faith rather than a political vehicle. So this is something that's been going on for a long time, and it's bred and it's developed in many ways, and it's only since the threat has been seen to shift and turn against the UK, partly as a consequence of the evolution of the ideology, but also clearly a consequence of our foreign policy engagements, that we've realised this is a problem. And we've come too late, and we don't know how to get back into the communities. We've got a new department, the Department of Communities and Local Government, whose almost entire remit is to understand how to create cohesion within the communities. But even understanding what the community is a problem, never mind knowing who to talk to and building the credibility to engage with them.
Okay, Hull.
Well, I just want to, as an American who's more or less, the government was more or less responsible for at least the Iraq intervention, I feel that now we're going to be in this phase of uncertainty for quite a while. First of all, because the election won't be in 2008, so we don't know the course of the new president at that time. But certainly the mood of the country is moving towards some sort of reconciliation. The Baker Hamilton report at least pointed to the possibility of more serious engagement with Iran, Syria, as well as the different warring factions within Iraq and dealing more directly in dialogue with the insurgents. Now, I fully agree with you that these groups, some of their demands are nearly impossible, but over time you can split some of them from others and begin to narrow down those who are the most militant once you yourself begin to engage in some policy compromises. So in my view, this all has to stem from the Americans who come down, and that will begin to change the situation. But until our policy changes, we're lost.
And on that, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we're unfortunately completely out of time for today's program. I'd like to thank our guests here in the studio, Hull Gardner, professor and chair of the Department of International Affairs at the American University of Paris, journalist and author Maureen Cofflard, and via satellite from London, Gary Hindle, the head of terrorism and international homeland security and resilience at the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks all so much for joining us. That is all for tonight. Bonsoir.